It's a sort of a midwinter picture on Marion from Ryan Reisinger.
And that's you, I assume.
No, it's not actually me. No, okay. This is a midwinter. The first time I went to Marion was actually in August, which was pretty bleak and cold. But this is what people kind of have a vision of Marion. They think it's covered in snow and cold and miserable, but that's really not the case most of the time, as we'll see. And I call this talk Birding Essays 10th Province, partly because it's somewhat provocative, and I've had a lot of people coming to me and saying, does this mean we can now start counting birds on our essay list? I was like, oh, God.
I thought we weren't going to talk about that.
Yeah, no, we'll annoy Trevor. So. But, you know, it is part of South Africa, and it's a very special part of South Africa. It's unfortunately a very hard place to get to, and so I get a lot of people coming to me and saying, oh, I'm really keen to go to Marion. Can you get me on a takeover? And increasingly the answer is, I'm sorry, it's really difficult because there's quite a lot of stuff that goes on the island, particularly during takeover, and so space on the ship is at a real premium, and space on the base, even though we've got this big fancy new base, is also at a premium. But anyway, we'll talk maybe at the end about potentials for getting down there. So this is the sort of Marion-centered view of the world. So that's where the Prince Edward Islands live. It's a group of 2 islands, and they sit squarely in the middle of the Southern Ocean. So pretty much halfway between Africa and Antarctica, in the middle of the Antarctic circumpolar current, or west wind drift, if you like. So it's a really special place. There's not a lot of land out there. It's a huge ocean. And so for the kinds of organisms like seabirds and seals that have to come ashore to breed, it's a really crucial outpost. And one of the challenges with climate change is there's nowhere for those birds and seals to go in terms of shifting latitudinally. So there's no islands further north, or critically, there's no islands further south. So as the planet warms, you know, they're a little bit screwed if they're relying on particularly things like king penguins, which are traveling south from the island 400 or 500 kilometers, even while breeding. As the polar front moves south, that's going to become increasingly tricky for those kinds of animals. So it's a group of 2 islands. We tend to talk about Marion the whole time because that's the larger of the 2 islands, but the group as a whole is named after the smaller island, Prince Edward, and they're pretty close. They're 20 kilometers apart. As you can see, Marion's quite a lot bigger. It's 295 square kilometers, so it's about half the size of the Cape Peninsula, I guess, to sort of put it in context. So to walk around the coast is about 80 kilometers or so, yeah. So it's a good stroll. Prince Edward is quite a lot smaller, only 45 square k's, much easier to get around, but very restricted access. So we're only allowed to go there once every 5 years, and there hasn't actually been a sanctioned visit to Prince Edward since 2008. So wow. We're not really sure what's going on with some of the populations there.
And what's the reason for that, just to keep it secluded?
Yeah, so Prince Edward is really very undisturbed in terms of introduction. So I'll talk a bit about the threats these islands face, but there's no introduced mammals. There's only 3 or 4 introduced plants. It's really not much has got there. And so the best way to keep it that way is to very severely restrict the number of visits.
Is it quite a significant process when you do go visit those islands in terms of checking what you're carrying with you?
Sure. I'll show you a slide just now of some of the stuff. So the islands are volcanic in origin. This is a view actually from behind the base on Marion, and that little spot that you can't probably see over the red hill there is actually the Esser Gullis out there at sea. So it gives you some idea. But this is a typical sort of landscape of Marion. So you've got these recent black lava flows. We're standing on a much older grey lava flow, and then you've got these red scoria hills that punctuate the landscape. And it's still an active volcano. It's the only active volcano in southern Africa. So this pale grey lava flow here is pale grey because it's been colonized by a moss. But this flow happened sometime in the last 30-odd years. So nobody was there when it happened. It was on the west side of the island, but it's a relatively new flow. So nobody's actually seen an eruption happen, but we know they are happening sporadically around the island, which is quite exciting. And the island is one of a group of 4 in what we might call the sort of Southwest Indian Ocean islands, subantarctic island chain. So we've got the Prince Edwards, and then moving to the east, the Crozet group and Kerguelen, which are both French islands, and then Heard Island and McDonald, which are Australasian or Australian islands. And those islands form a sort of biogeographic province, and there's a couple of birds that are only found there. And this is the kind of picture that people think when they're going to go into the Southern Ocean. This is actually a really old shot of mine taken from a video grab. it's actually very unusual to see this kind of condition. And this was actually taken going west out of Cape Town towards Gough in spring. We typically go down to Marion in late summer, and we're more likely to see seas like this than you are to see those amazing big seas. So it's a bit of hit and miss, the kind of weather you get, but certainly in summer, the weather is not as bad as people would make out a lot of the time. Just heading south, you get quite a nice transect from Cape Town down to the subantarctic. You move through a bunch of different waters. So in summer, you're going to be seeing things like lots of great winged petrels. Just saw some tracking data from great wings from Marion the last week. Really interesting to see. They go really far north, right up to Angola and northern Mozambique during summer. And they're one of these topsy-turvy birds that breeds in the winter in the south and then moves north in summer, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Wow. Just, the usual sort of thing. So I'm just going to give you some pretty pictures of birds as we're heading south. Black-browed albatross. Lots of soft plumes once you get into the Agulhas retroflexion, probably the commonest bird out there. And then once you get off the shelf edge, obviously you start seeing the first great albatrosses. This is probably a young wanderer, but very difficult to tell these buggers apart. And then once you get into the retroflexion, start seeing sooty albatrosses as well, which is always a delight. Really spectacular birds. Little subantarctic shearwaters mixed in with little shearwaters. It's always fun to try to tell those two apart. And then once again, in these kind of mixed waters around the subtropical convergence is where most of the salvins prions occur. And then once you get south of the convergence into water that's cooler than about 15 degrees, getting down towards 10 degrees, when you start getting into the more subantarctic things, which in summer would be things like a black-bellied storm petrel, which does its wonderful skiing across the water. They really are great birds. All the fregattas do that sort of characteristic skiing motion. And then again, in cooler waters, once you get close to Marion, the sort of resident prion, and often the commonest prion if the salvins aren't around, is a fairy prion, a very petite, very attractive.
Much paler than the prions in Antarctic. Is that right?
It's one of the easier prions to identify, although I see that Steve Howell's new book has just come out and split fairy into 2 species and fulmar into 2 species. So there's now 10 species of prion, as if it wasn't enough of trouble with 7.
And I guess the 2 fairy prion species are very similar, so quite hard to separate. But
I think geographically so there's the one is confined largely to the New Zealand area, I think. But who knows where they go at sea? But certainly breeding-wise. And I'm not sure what the basis of those splits are, so it's interesting. And this is when I was talking about seeing a wanderer doing its thing. If you do pelagics out of Cape Town, you're pretty much forced to go out when the weather's good. And when you see a wanderer, it looks kind of lumbering and heavy with this big hunchback. But once you see them out in real conditions that they enjoy, then they toss around like a soft plume. Yeah, they're just wonderful birds. They really are spectacular. And again, obviously, getting further south, you start seeing the light-mantled sooties, which are much less abundant than sooties around Marion, maybe 1/10 of the population or less. And the grey-headeds become fairly common once you get close to the island, although they primarily forage to the south of the island. And then there's a bunch of species that you only really see right at the island, or in fact, if you go further south. So things like Kerguelen petrel and blue petrel blues in particular breed in really big numbers. I can't remember what our estimate was, 130,000 pairs, I think, on Marion alone. But you really don't see them until you're right at the island. And they feed south from there. So they don't disperse north of the island, except for the very occasional eruption year like 1984.
And is that just because of sea temps? Is that temperature and food availability?
Yeah, we don't really fully understand why, but that's just what they do. They're very cool birds, blues. And then once you get, again, fairly close to the island, you start seeing things like the diving petrels, which are one of the few groups that don't get into southern African waters. But of course, telling South Georgian from common is a nightmare in the field. And people who tell you they can do it are probably kidding themselves. It's best to get them in the hand.
And that one, so that photograph, I mean, we're not familiar with the diving petrels as southern African birders. Is that bird identifiable from a photograph?
It's probably a common, but I
wouldn't put your head on a boat.
No. Generally speaking, the ones close to the island are commons, and the ones further away are South Georgians. But
circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, and the features you're kind of looking at are subtle and nothing really diagnostic you can put your finger on. So it's not great. Pintados, interestingly, have been just discovered breeding on the island in the last few years. So they breed at Crozet and Kerguelen in reasonable numbers. But it's only about 2 years ago that we were discovered breeding on Marion. There's 2 or 3 pairs that breed on the south coast of the island. You do see them around the island fairly regularly. And then there's a bunch of birds that are fairly regular around the island that don't breed there. Things like white-headed petrels, not common, but certainly fairly regular. Interesting photo that you can see the big mix of feather ages. And this bird's obviously molting its outer primaries. But if you see the greater coverts are all new compared to the secondaries, quite interesting. And then, not to be left out, of course, there's a bunch of nice marine mammals as you move south. So these are striped dolphins, which would be typical of the warmer waters of the Gullis retroflexion. But for me, the really exciting animal to try to see once you get particularly further south is southern right-whale dolphin, which I saw for the first time in 1984 on my very first trip to Marion, and I didn't see again until about 3 or 4 years ago. I was at, actually, these were taken off Tristan. So I've only seen the animal twice in all the time at sea. But some people go out and see it the first time they go, it just depends. But it's an amazing creature. Okay, so after your sort of, depending on your ship, 3, 4, 5 days at sea, you arrive at Marion, and you're quite happy to see some greenery after all that time. And it does lie in the heart of the roaring 40s. It's about 47 degrees south.
Is that a flat day?
No, that's a pretty wild day. So this day we couldn't go ashore. We just sat off in the lee of the island and waited for the wind to subside. But before you can go ashore, it's really important that you make sure that everything that goes ashore is clean. So typically you take everything new, or if you've got to take gear that's been used somewhere else, we have a whole inspection process to make sure that it's clean. Because these islands, the organisms that live there have evolved in the absence of a whole bunch of things that occur on continents. And if we introduce them, we really run the risk of...
Are they vacuuming that?
Looks like a pool cue.
Yeah, I think it's a walking pole or something that he's got there. But yeah, so all your camera bags and day packs and anything that's been used anywhere else, everything has to be vacuumed and the pockets turned inside out, shaken out, and so on. And all the Velcro inspected. Velcro is a pain in the ass because it attracts seeds. So ideally, we should really have just dedicated gear for Marion. If we go to Prince Edward, we're not allowed to use anything that's used anywhere else, even on Prince Edward before. So everything has to be bought new, which makes it quite a pricey exercise to go there. So this is the rather messy base situation on Marion. So in the foreground, you've got the old base, which was supposed to be dismantled, but the new base overran budget and overran on time. So they finished building the new base and didn't have any budget to dismantle the old base, so it still sits there. So it's kind of slowly falling apart. It's got a lot of character for those of us who've known it for many years, but it's basically uninhabitable these days. And this is the fancy new base. Sure. It's called a leaky pumpkin because it's orange and leaks. But it's a really cool design. It has this helipad where all of the cargo can, sort of food supplies and things can be dropped. And there's a little forklift that can just whip out and take the containers straight into the base. So it's a very efficient design. It's a little bit big for most of the year, but during takeover, all that space gets used. This was the original accommodation. So South Africa annexed the islands in 1947, just after the Second World War. And the first accommodation was this little sort of wooden shack right on the beach next to where the current base is in Transvaal Cove.
Which seal is that?
That's a Tropicalis subantarctic fur seal. And it was annexed originally as a weather station. So this is obviously the weather observation, Stevenson screen, and anemometer, and all that sort of junk. And on the building on the left there is the oldest building still standing on the island. It dates back to the early 1950s. And the idea is that will be retained as some kind of museum to record the cultural history of the island. And you get a kind of misleading opinion of the weather if you live at the base the whole time, because the predominant winds come from the west, and the island is over 1,300 meters high, and so that mountain peak breaks the cloud layer. So the Southern Ocean typically is clothed in a layer of cloud, and by breaking that cloud layer, you're often sitting in a little sunny hole on the east side of the island.
Okay. So the base is on the eastern side.
Yeah, it's on the sheltered side, sort of northeast coast. And people will be in base, they'll be sitting around getting a suntan, and you come in wet and bedraggled, and they kind of go, "Yeah, what a beautiful day." And you go, "Well, maybe not so much," but you do get to see the most amazing clouds. Just if you're into weather, there's some amazing stuff. So this was a particularly cool cloud. I saw the one day, lots of lenticulars again.
Wow, look at that.
Strong winds blowing over the peak. It forms these sort of, I suppose, lens-shaped clouds that stack up like a pile of pancakes on top of the island. Interesting intertidal. The islands drop off fairly quickly, but there's this amazingly tough bull kelp, Davilia antarctica, that clothes the coastline. It's quite impressive. It withstands the most amazing wave action. The vegetation on the island itself is pretty low-lying, shall we say. There's nothing taller than about 30-centimeter grass.
Sure.
There's a mix of mosses, ferns, grasses, a few angiosperms, but not a vast selection. This is probably the most charismatic plant, a thing called a Kerguelen cabbage, which the early sailors used to use as a cure for scurvy. Interesting, there was a lot of concern around the conservation of this species some time ago because a diamondback moth arrived on the island and the caterpillars started chewing up the cabbages, and there was a real concern that they were going to be severely impacted, but they seem to have come back now and doing okay.
Are those cabbages endemic to Marion, or with a name, you'd expect it to occur on those other islands?
Yeah, so it occurs throughout. I think it actually even reaches Heard now, but certainly it's on Kerguelen and Crozet as well, but it's just confined to that sort of Kerguelen province, if you like. One of the plants that's less popular with people on the island is this thing called a dog catcher by the island, Tristan Islanders. So it's actually a member of the rose family. Acina, there's a whole bunch of Acinas around this southern hemisphere, and they're bird dispersed. So they have these sticky seeds that attach themselves to everything, including you. Get them in your socks, you'll know all about it. They're really quite unpleasant. So late summer, they're a pain. So this is a typical sort of Marion Maya landscape with a wandering albatross, and wanderers are really kind of an icon for the island. Marion has about 25% of the world population just on Marion, another 20% on Prince Edward. So between the two islands, we have virtually half the world's population of wandering albatrosses.
Wow.
So it's a really important place for these birds. And they're just so charismatic. We tend to be there in sort of April, May, when the little chicks are just starting to become independent. So the parents lay their eggs in late December, January, the chicks hatch in March, and by sort of mid-April, they're starting to be left alone for the first time.
How big is that nest piece? What sort of, is it 25 centimeters height-wise, or 30?
Yeah, the height varies quite a lot. Depends on where the habitat is and how good a parent it is. And the chicks, once they get bigger, start building them up. And in fact, once they get really big, they waddle off and go and build play nests all over the place.
Okay.
They become quite mobile.
Okay.
But yeah, that chick's about the size of a big chicken at this stage, I suppose. But by the time by late winter, they weigh quite a lot more than their parents. It's typical of these seabirds that they put on a huge amount of weight and weigh more than their parents, full of fat, basically. Okay. At this stage, it's just a stomach with a beak attached. The wanderers are really great. You're not supposed to kind of go closer than a certain, distance from the birds. There's a whole bunch of rules on the island, but we tend to flout occasionally, pretending to read wings or something. But I was just lying next to this pair displaying and mucking about, and the bird with its wing up there, that's a really wide-angle shot. It kept hitting me with its wing, and they just carry on. They really are great animals. Yeah. Again, just checking you out.
Phenomenal.
So we've been doing a lot of work on the wanderers dating back to the 1980s. John Cooper started a series of long-term study colonies. There's 3 different colonies that are studied. Every year the birds are checked to see who's still alive, who they're mating with, whether they produce babies, and so on. So it's a really nice long-term data set to track the health of this population.
And that bird's very close to the base.
Yeah, you can see the old base in the background there. The birds who are really close to base are a little bit more gun shy than the ones further away because they've been sort of harassed over the years, but still they're pretty chilled. You can see the bird's not getting off its nest. It kind of probably knows that it's about to be annoyed, but it's still, they're very good parents. They just sit and
That
take
photo gives a very good perspective of the size of the bird.
Wow.
Yeah, and Mael's not the smallest person in the world, so it's not like I've picked a dwarf or something. if you've got like,
I hope she's not listening to the webinar.
Yeah, you never know. These things have a way of getting around. So if you've got a couple of hours ashore, probably the coolest place to go to is called Ship's Cove. It's really the only sandy beach on the island. It's this beautiful sheltered bay. Big group of king penguins typically comes out and roosts on the beach here. They very seldom breed there, but it's a really nice place to go down to the beach and hang out.
Oh.
The cliffs around have got both species of sooty albatrosses breeding on the cliffs. The sooties are really very, very aerial. You can see they've got these insanely long, thin wings. They've got the most extreme aspect ratio of any bird in the world. And when they do these aerial tandem flights, they put on this really gooky look. The one at the back there is just kind of doing it a bit, but they stretch out the neck and go really thin.
That front one looks like it's looking at you. It's sort of giving you the beady eye.
Yeah, they're such cool birds. That's a light mantled on the nest. As I say, light mantle's much less common, and actually, interestingly, doing much less well. So their population seems to be dwindling at Marion, whereas the sooties, which are the endangered species, actually the numbers are increasing quite happily at Marion.
And do we know why?
Encouraging. Well, again, it's easy to say light mantle's right at the north end of its range, climate change, but we don't really know why the light mantles are not doing very well.
Okay.
And if you go down to the beach, you spend your time looking at the king penguins come and look at you. So as soon as you squat down, they just think you're another penguin and they'll come running over to have a look. And you can just spend a lot of time and blow a lot of pixels taking pictures of king penguins.
Oh, look at that.
They really are cool. They've got this amazing eye. You probably know the story, but they've got the most extreme pupillary response of any bird that's known. So they can open their pupil to let in 300 times more light when it's fully open from when it's fully closed. And that's to do with the fact that they're feeding at 200 to 300 meters down, and they don't have a lot of time to accommodate chemically, so they just want to let as much light in as possible. And the kings are
very well spaced.
Crazy birds.
Spaced.
Basically they just stand just out of peck distance from the neighbor. And they're like emperors. They don't build a nest. They just sit with the single egg on their feet.
Yeah.
And so, you can shuffle a little bit. So if the neighbor comes in a bit, you'll shuffle a bit, and everybody will shuffle a bit.
Like self-correct.
Yeah. So when they're incubating, it's all very orderly. But once the chicks come out, then it just becomes very noisy, chaotic. And, people look at pictures of penguins and think, oh, they're so cute. But the smell in this place, I mean, I've got a pretty strong nose, but it can be pretty unpleasant in some of these colonies. And some of it's a sort of awkward teenage phase that they go through sometimes. So the 4 penguins breeding on the island, the king's probably the most charismatic and big, and then macaroni's the most abundant penguin on the island. Some really big colonies of macaronis. You can see this one's built its nest out of the bones of other penguins. So they breed in these really dense colonies where they strip the vegetation right down to bedrock. There's a small proportion of white-faced royal type penguins. Interestingly, the latest genetic stuff shows pretty clearly that royal's not a good species, so it's being lumped with macaroni. But interestingly, the rockhoppers are being split 3 ways, so eastern, western, and southern, or whatever it is. Northern, southern, and eastern. Okay. Yeah, so currently there's the northern rockhopper from Tristan and Amsterdam, and then the southern one was 1 species, but the birds from Falklands and southern South America, I think, are now separate from Phil Holy, the eastern one. So this is the biggest penguin colony on the island, I guess, it's Kildalkey. So in the foreground, that's all macaronis, and in the background, king penguins down the bottom of the bay.
How long a walk is it from the base to that?
Kildalkey's about a 3-hour stroll, I suppose.
Quite a long way.
Yeah, it's not super close. And the dividing line between the 2 species is pretty clear cut. This is one macaroni who's got a bit lost and got into the kings, but the kings pretty much sort them out, and so they don't stray in there too often. And this is
So are you going to come to the other 2 penguin species?
Yeah,
okay,
we'll
I'll
get there
wait for that.
So this is just foot scoring. So
Wow.
from the Mackies
Climbing out.
jumping up the rocks, just in the colonies. So
Amazing.
just from the scoring. And these rocks are pretty hard, these hard grey lavas. So the small cousin of the macaroni is the southern rockhopper or eastern rockhopper, and it differs from the one that you get in the Falklands in having this pink line around the base of the bill, whereas that's missing in the one that's just been split. And compared to the northern rockhopper, they've got much smaller head plumes. Pretty nice birds. Both of these species have decreased quite dramatically through the 90s into the 2000s, but their numbers now seem to be more or less stable for the last decade or so, which is at least encouraging. And again, we don't really understand why they're decreasing. We've got a student looking at that at the moment. And then the final species of penguin is the gentoo, by far the least abundant on the island. It's also unusual and it breeds primarily in winter. And yeah, much more agile than the other penguins, breeds inland in small colonies, often up to 1 kilometer inland, and they don't trash the environment in the same way that the other species do. It's not to say that they're not a little bit bolshy, and they'll certainly pick a fight. And they're surprisingly big. They kind of don't look particularly big, but they're bigger than macaronis. And probably after kings, the second fastest penguin, really very swift swimmers. And that's just a baby gentoo. They're cute. And while we're talking about things aquatic, lots of elephant seals on the island, really well-studied population of elephant seals. They're pretty cute animals. Guys at the University of Pretoria, Martin Bester in particular, and now Nico de Bruyn have been studying the elephant seal population on Marion intensively again since the 1980s. So every pup on the island gets tagged, and every, I can't remember, it's 5 or 10 days, people go around all of the beaches and check who's on the island and so on.
Oh, really?
So really very intensive long-term study of elephant seals. And they do all sorts of horrible things like stick devices onto them so they can see where they go. So
that's a tracking device on the top of the head?
Yeah, tracking and pressure and temperature. So it actually collects oceanographic data. These guys routinely dive down to 600 to 800 meters, and the males go
600 to 800 meters.
Yeah, and when they're feeding, they'll spend sort of 5 to 10 minutes at the surface and then go down for 40 to 50 minutes, and then back for 5 to 10. And so they spend most of their lives down in the deep. Wow. And the males go much deeper because they're bigger. So I think the dive record now for a male is over 2 kilometers, maybe 2.2 kilometers.
Unbelievable.
Pretty crazy. And then there's 2 species of fur seal on the island. This is the subantarctic tropicalis, and the bull tropicalis, pretty bolshy, particularly around sort of October, November. They become quite aggressive during the breeding season, makes it interesting moving around the beaches. And then gazella, who are just psychotic the whole time, the Antarctic fur seal. These guys will just see you coming and they'll just come galumphing across the plain after you. It's like, the sealers tell you that they're much more predictable, and if you just give them a good prod with a stick, they'll stop, but I tend to run. They're pretty big animals, and I don't want to get bitten by one. So the coastal zone is really quite busy. It's often packed. There's a whole bunch of kings and
elephant seals,
ellies all lining up, and a couple of young ellies playing in the surf. And those guys have got to be careful, because just lurking offshore, this is not one of my picks, this is one of the feeders' picks. But the killers come right into the shallows. Occasionally get it wrong. There was one a few years ago, a big female actually got stuck.
It beached itself.
Got beached, yeah, and the guys went down and tried to push her in, but just too big. Yeah. But she managed to get off in the night. The swell came up and the tide came up, and she got off.
I wouldn't think it's just too big. It's also just too sharp and pointy at the one end of the animal.
Yeah, there's a whole sort of like dichotomous thought about killers. So there was a phase where people used to go diving with them a lot. They made a cage and they used to lower it down off the crane, and then people just got casual and started jumping in with them. And so the one school of thought says that the killers are really intelligent and they won't attack you. And there's another school of thought that says, well, you look pretty much like an elephant seal. So, yeah, I don't know. Certainly people have been in the water with them and not been attacked. So interesting. They're pretty cool animals. Again, they've been a really interesting series of studies done on them over the last decade or so by the University of Pretoria.
Do you see them quite regularly?
Particularly in summer, yeah. It's always a kind of an event. So if you're in base, the people go on the intercom, killers at the point, and everybody runs down to go and watch the killers. But if you're there for a takeover, you should see them fairly often, yeah. In winter, they're not quite so regular. And then there's 2 species of GP breed on the island. This is the northern, you can see with the reddish billtip. Quite nice, more approachable than the southerns generally. They breed singly up against rocks, so generally a bit more approachable. This is a southern with a greenish billtip. And these guys are kind of hunter scavengers on the island. The males in particular do a lot of feeding on the island, whereas the females tend to leave the island to go feed at sea. And it can get a bit messy at times. And sometimes they get outnumbered by the skuas. So there's a whole scavenging guild, but that penguin probably was killed by a GP, and then everybody's climbed in to get a piece of it. The white-faced southerns don't breed on Marion typically. We've had the odd one breeding on Prince Edward in the past, and maybe occasionally on Marion, but typically they're kind of a vagrant at Marion.
Okay. Is the white-face southern GP, is it a recessive gene? So a white-face can have normal dark offspring?
Yeah, I'm not 100%. So given your previous comments about not making any rash statements, I'll take the fifth on that one. I don't know. But the proportion does vary geographically, and generally there's a tendency for them to become more common further south. So like at Gough, which is the northernmost population of southerns, there are no whites at all. But by the time you get to some colonies down in the Antarctic Peninsula, maybe 15 to 20% are white. Okay. So the easy just so story is that it's to do with camouflage and being further south, you get more white ones, but apparently it isn't a completely clear-cut latitudinal signal. And the GPs...
taking a penguin.
Yeah, they're pretty interesting. They get up to all sorts of nasty tricks. This was actually at Nightingale, killing a northern rockhopper. So they're pretty interesting. And a few years ago, we had suddenly a lot of our wanderer chicks in one particular area started disappearing, and we put out cameras and we could see. So the defense of the wanderer chicks, once they're left alone, is to puke stomach oil onto birds. Any bird predator that gets too close, it ruins the waterproofing on their feathers. And so the GP kind of just does this crazy dance. So he goes running round and round, and eventually the chick runs out of puke. And that's the end of the chick. It's dragged off, and that's it. But
is anything done about that to stop the...
No, because it's really difficult to do anything about it, and it's kind of a natural thing. And it's at the moment, it's confined to just one of our 3 study colonies. But why... It started about 6 or 7 years ago. It wasn't happening before then, and you can see from our long-term monitoring that it wasn't happening. It's only the northern giants that seem to do it. So whether it's a new trick they've learned, and I guess we need to keep an eye on it if it becomes a problem, if it spreads. But at the moment, it's kind of okay-ish,
contained, and
and they also get into this is a grey-headed albatross chick that's been taken by a GP. Again, it's the male northerns that do it, and you can see they're pretty chilled about not wanting to leave the carcass. So this is Stefan Scoombie kind of having a poke at the carcass as well. And then we've got brown skuas on the island. The skua taxonomy is a complete mess. I got somebody send me a picture the other day of, is this a Tristan skua? I'm like, well, what is a Tristan skua? Even between South Polars, Chilean and brown, there's gene flow. So we don't really know what's going on. But interestingly, they have these very varied distributions. So this is some tracking data from Crozet and Kerguelen, and each colored spot there is a different brown skua. So, some of them come to the Benguela, some go off to Australia, some go up into tropical waters around the Seychelles or around the Mascarenes, others up to Indonesia, and others stay down in the Southern Ocean. So really quite
hard to make sense of.
Yeah, well, I guess they're quite idiosyncratic. So even on the island, one pair will be a penguin specialist, another pair will be a blue petrel specialist. And they have their little thing that they do. And they're incredibly intelligent. They recognize individuals. So, if you're trying to catch a skua, they'll happily sit next to some boring sealer, but as soon as you see a birder coming along, they'll go, oh, that guy's a birder, and they'll be out of there.
Distinctive jizz.
And then there's kelp gulls on the island, but with all these macho other birds around. Kelp gulls on Marion are just pathetic. They just kind of whimper around the edges. They spend a lot of time feeding on insects, and they're way down the pecking order. In fact, they're kind of displaced even by the sheathbill, which is the only non-seabird found on the island. So this is the black-faced or lesser sheathbill. And this is one of the endemics to the Kerguelen arc of islands.
So there are no passerines on the island?
No.
Is it, did there used to be passerines on the island? Or?
No. No, so there's no real sort of shelter or habitat for them. It's so low-lying. Sinclair tells the story of when he was there for 6 months. He saw a yellow wagtail. He got super excited. You know, it was like the first passerine he'd seen in 3 months. And as he was watching it, a skua came down, and that was his last passerine. You know, so we get vagrants pitching up. Typically swallows, cattle egrets, but all sorts of weird things have pitched up. I saw a whitethroat there the one year.
A whitethroat.
Whitethroat,
Wow.
yeah, common whitethroat. Corncrake has made it.
Really?
Sure.
Just weird stuff.
Well, there was that photograph, Trevor shared, the blacksmith flapping,
which is the third record, and you know, yeah. So but I don't think generally they don't last very long because of the skua pressure, if nothing else. So the sheathbills are really cool. They're kind of related to oyster catchers, vaguely, distantly, but they're in their own family. And these guys are supreme specialists, supreme generalists. They'll eat anything. One of my first students on the island, Dion Nell, said that, you know, all that's going through their head is, can I eat this? Can I eat this? Can I eat this? Because they'll just come up and peck anything. So they're really good at stealing eggs from people. They raise their chicks by stealing food from penguins and cormorants, basically. So they're professional thieves. You know, that's how they raise their chicks, is by stealing.
And are they common on the island?
Yeah, they're not as common as they used to be because of in winter they used to rely quite heavily on feeding on inverts. So they used to move into the mires. So in summer they're feeding in the seabird colonies, and they're raising their chicks by stealing food from the seabirds. But in winter, when the penguins are gone, the cormorants are not really doing much, they relied on mainly terrestrial inverts, and unfortunately the mice have been eating all of those. So the numbers of sheathbills have dropped to some extent. They're still pretty common. And they really don't give a toss. So this is a macaroni penguin carcass that's probably several weeks, if not months old. And, you know, he's still having a good old root around just in case he missed something the last time that he had a look in there. And
Sure.
if you fall asleep on the beach, they'll come and pick your nose. Or, they love picking elephant seal wounds. You know, they wait until elephant seal's asleep, and then they go and pull a piece. And, and then
Like Jabba the Hutt.
Yeah.
And then the other sort of endemic, and this is more of an endemic than the sheathbill, is the crozet shag. So taxonomy of these southern shags is quite controversial, but at the moment, people basically say that the crozet shag is only found on Marion and the crozets. So it's a two-island endemic. Very pretty, particularly in the breeding season. This is not really a breeding adult, but they get those caruncles on the bill become even more exaggerated, and the blue around the eye becomes even richer when they're pre-breeding. And these guys are impressive. So the diving record for a cormorant is held by one of these leucocarbo shags. So they can dive down to over 120 meters.
Sure.
But when they do that, they're diving anaerobically. So they really push themselves, and they have these very long recovery times. So when they dive aerobically, they can spend 3 times longer underwater than on the surface. But as soon as they move to anaerobic, they have this much longer recovery. They have to spend 3 times more on the surface than they do underwater. And the shag is not doing massively well. The population decreased again, seems to have stabilized a bit, but it's still reasonably common on the island. And then there's 2 species of tern. We've got the Antarctic tern, who should be familiar for most South African birders, although their numbers not doing great around Southern Africa in winter. And then Kerguelen tern, which is the special tern that everyone wants to go see, because it again only occurs in the Kerguelen arc of islands. And it's pretty similar to an Antarctic tern, just a little bit smaller. It's a bit like the difference between an Arctic and a common. It's the Arctic version. It's got the shorter, more delicate bill, the shorter legs, and it's a little bit grayer. And these guys feed quite a lot over the mires. Antarctics do as well, but not so much, particularly at Marion. But this actually got a caterpillar in its beak. So they feed by walking around or by flying over the mires and picking up insects. And again, with the mice on the island, that's not been good for them. And the juveniles are really very dusky, more so than juvenile Antarctic terns. Okay, so I'm probably starting to lose audience by waffling on for too long, so I'll move along a little more swiftly. There's a whole bunch of burrowing petrels that you generally don't see unless you go out at night. The one that's big enough to really sit around during the day is the white-chinned petrel. It's the biggest burrowing petrel in the world. It's still listed as vulnerable globally because of the big impact of longline fishing, but the population on Marion has recovered best since the cats have gone. So this is the burrowing petrel which has really benefited most from the removal of cats on the island in terms of population recovery. So they're actually doing pretty well.
When was the last cat removed?
1990, 91 was the last cat. So it's been getting on for close to 30 years now.
Sure.
So quite impressive. We'll talk about that right at the end.
Cool.
And then obviously the close relative of the white chin is the grey petrel. This is very much a different story. He's a winter breeder. They were really hammered by the cats because the cats struggled to find food in winter, just like the sheathbills did. There wasn't a lot of food around, so the few winter breeding species, the great winged petrels and the grey petrels, were really hammered by the cats. And their numbers haven't come back. If anything, they seem to be even fewer than they were historically. Wow. And we don't really understand why that is, but always nice to see them. And they often breed in caves rather than in burrows. And so this is actually a bird incubating an egg in a cave. So you can actually get in there and see it on the egg, which is really cool. And then one of the really nice things about Marion is just the ability to get out and go around the island, particularly if you're going to be stuck there for a year. You don't want to be stuck in the base the whole time. And there's some just really wonderful walking. Weather can be a little inclement at times. There's two places where you can't easily walk. Well, you can't walk around the coast at all. This is Trichardt Bay in the sort of northwest end of the island, and you have to go up over those cliffs. So it's about, 250, 300 meter climb because you can't get around the coast here. And there's a similar place down the south coast. And of course, when this is an unusually good day, but a lot of the time it's cloudy and misty up there. And so you're walking in this kind of low vis condition. And at least historically, before GPS, that was always a bit interesting, finding your way in these conditions. But interestingly, the only people who've actually died on Marion have drowned. Nobody's actually died through exposure.
Falling off.
Yeah, I mean, there have been people who've done stupid things and nearly died, but compared to Gough, where we've lost 3 or 4 people, Marion has this tradition of not having killed anyone yet. There are a couple of crosses on the island, and those were guys who drowned in small boat operations. And the other really nice thing about Marion is that there's this network of huts spread around the island. So I said it was about 80 k's to walk around the periphery, but you've got a hut every sort of 2 to 3 hours walk. So
that's nice.
For field work, it's great. You can come in dripping wet, but there's somewhere you can hang up your wet gear and you can turn on a gas heater and dry stuff. So the next day, at least, you're not starting off soaking wet. So it's a huge advance on having to put up a tent. And there's food in the huts that gets replenished once a year, so you don't even have to carry food.
Okay.
If you really want to, there's some slightly miffed sleeping bags in there, so you can actually day pack around the island if you want to travel light and fast. This is one of the old huts, which were just full of graffiti. Guys, particularly during the cat hunting era, would spend all their days lying in the hut and then go hunting at night. And so they spent a lot of time writing shit on the walls. And then when the huts were replaced, a few years ago, there was a very strict edict. You weren't allowed to write on the walls, and it's actually been pretty well adhered to. So this is Mike Schramm, who actually did his MSc in the late 70s, and he went back to the island about 2012, 13 maybe, to see how things had changed with the burrowing petrels. So he was.
Is there a minibar in those huts?
Not as such. Yeah, sometimes if you scratch around in a sealer bin, you might find a bit of dodgy food.
Old brown sherry.
Yeah. So the ablution facilities leave something to be desired. This is one of the more glamorous ones with a modified deck chair. But yeah, the perennial issues with where to put the loo. So they're typically still long drop loos. And there have been various attempts to have loos that catch everything and get taken away, but never quite worked. So, interesting. So
just dig a hole and cover it at the end of the season.
Yeah, so one of these pit toilets might last 2 or 3 years and then cover it up with lava and you dig another one kind of thing. And it doesn't look too bad on a day like this, but when it's kind of blowing horizontal sleet and it's pitch black at night, it's not really fun to go out and find your way to the loop. Yeah, so one of the reasons you want to go around the island is the only place where the grey-headeds breed is on the south side. So this is Grey-headed Ridge, which is one of the big grey-headed colonies. This is a chick on its nest. The greyheads are just beautiful birds up close. And then one of the real mysteries about Marion is the yellow-nosed albatrosses. There's none breeding on Marion for some reason, but there's 9,000 pairs maybe on Prince Edward. So this is one of the reasons why we're keen to go to Prince Edward at least occasionally, is to get some idea of what's happening with this population. So elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, the only place where they're really monitored is on Amsterdam Island, and there the numbers are crashing, but they have a terrible problem with avian cholera there. So it's become endemic in the albatross populations, and their breeding success is appalling because most of the chicks die from cholera. And that's because the French had chickens on the island and ducks and all sorts of crap. So the French were very slow to kind of start to really put in place strong quarantines. And this is a photo of Albatross Valley on Prince Edward. So this is a mixed colony of grey-headeds and yellow-nose. It's just the most wonderful place, and it's a shame we can't get there more often. And last time I was there, we discovered white-capped or shy albatross incubating, just the one bird. We don't know what the partner was, but probably was a white-capped as well. So potentially 6 species of albatross breeding on Prince Edward, which is really cool.
Wow.
And then once you've been around the island of Marion, there's this kind of draw. You get sucked towards the interior because it's kind of the periphery is great, but there's that hinterland that you want to go and explore. And you can vaguely make out perhaps Prince Edward in the background there. But yeah, it's a different world. So as you go up, you often break through the cloud layer. So again, that's Prince Edward in the distance, just rising above the cloud. And the islands, as I was saying, create these amazing vortices. So this is a satellite view of the 2 islands on the left there, and the diffraction pattern as the wind blows past in the cloud layer. So it's like putting 2 sticks into a stream and seeing how the ripples go downstream. So we're looking at hundreds of kilometers of effect going to the east there. And then this is a closer up pattern on a low wind day. You can see the vortices in the cloud.
And there's that hole in the clouds.
There's the hole, yeah. So the base sits right in that hole.
Yeah.
And there's another day when a light wind from the south, beautiful day on the island.
Amazing.
Yeah, incredible stuff.
Yeah.
Sure.
And as I say, the island gets up to over 1,200 meters and can be, you've got to pick your day to go up there. It can be really unpleasantly windy and like you can't walk. We went up on the day just after it had been blowing, and this rock was kind of, those ice crystals had formed by the wind just howling around this rock and accreting basically moisture to form these crystals. So it was just the most amazing patterns in the crystals around the rock. There's a little bit of permanent ice left up top. So one of the big attractions is to go find the remaining ice caves on top and go exploring. But it's disappearing quickly. So we're seeing very rapid climate change. So the temperature has increased by around about 0.2 degrees per decade, and rainfall's decreased dramatically. So back in the good old days, people really used to fall in the bogs a lot. These days, unless you're really heavy-footed, you tend not to fall in the bogs anything like as much. So this top picture shows the ice plateau on Marion in 1966 when there was the Van Zinderen Bakker expedition, and that's what it looks like now.
Wow.
So we had a glacier in South Africa, and now we don't have a glacier anymore. This is an arch with somebody standing in. If you look closely, you can see there's actually somebody standing in that arch. That was April 2008, and that was the same arch 1 year later. So it's just shocking how quickly that ice has gone back in 1 year.
Sure.
And so climate change is a big factor, but the other big factor, historically at least, has been the impact of introduced mammals. So we've already talked about the cats. So the first mammal introduced to the island were house mice, which got there sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s. when sealers were put ashore. I mean, just the most insane conditions. People would be given like a bunch of wooden staves to make barrels, maybe a bit of salt pork or something, and just, you know, put ashore. We'll pick you up in 6 months if you're lucky, you know, make sure the barrels are full of oil and you've got a few seal skins kind of thing.
Sure.
And somewhere along the way, mice came along with these poor guys. And when South Africa annexed the island and put the weather station there, the mice were a bit of a pest around the base. And so they thought, well, we'll take a few cats down. And somebody got the sexing wrong, because soon we had more than a couple of cats. And so by the 1970s, there were about 2,000 cats. I remember seeing cat when I first went to the island in '84. They were already by then starting to get knocked back because we'd introduced feline influenza by that stage. But those 2,000 cats were killing close to 500,000 burrowing petrels each year. So they were killing mice, but nothing like what they were killing in the way of burrowing petrels. And this picture was actually taken on Kerguelen, where there are still cats, and the cats are starting to get into the wandering albatrosses on Kerguelen, which is really worrying. Oh. And so we saw the extinction of common diving petrels, and probably all the storm petrels on the island disappeared. And yeah, the cats had a really massive impact on the winter breeders as well. And then this attempt was made to eradicate the cats. It started in the 70s with the introduction of the feline influenza, and then there was this active hunting program. So these slightly dodgy guys were recruited to go.
I'm sure one of those is you, Pete.
No, I didn't do the cat hunter era. These were tough guys. They had hair on their teeth. So you can just imagine, it's bad enough strolling around this terrain in daylight. They were out there at night in all weathers with spotlights and shotguns shooting cats. Pretty amazing. And then as the catch rate from shooting started to drop, they started building funnel traps and putting out poison bait, and just kept at it. And Martin Bester really deserves all the credit for that, because it was really about motivating people to go out and do that sort of work. Mm-hmm. And Martin is that kind of guy, you know, he led by example, and he just, you know, he can motivate people.
Drove it.
And put in a good decade of his life making sure that cats disappeared from Marion.
Sure.
And we still find the odd sign. So when I was there last year, actually found some cat scat in a cave, and you kind of like have this sudden but we're pretty sure they've gone. You know, with snow over the island, you'd see if there were any tracks, and you don't. There's no evidence that there's been one since 1990. The trouble is, of course, once the cats have gone, the mice go back to being the only mammal on the island. And what we've seen, it took a while, but we've started to see the impact of mice. So up until 2000, we didn't think mice were really a big threat to seabirds, but you probably all know the story. 2000, Richard Cuthbert was on Gough and started to see the big Tristan albatross chicks disappearing, dying mysteriously. And he thought the only thing could be that it was mice. So Ross and Andy went out to the island in 2004, and they got the first footage, actually filmed mice attacking the albatross chicks. And since then, we know that they attack pretty much anything on the island. And the first wandering albatross chick was attacked on Marion in 2002, and it's been at a low level ever since. We had the first attack on a city albatross chick in 2009, and then 2015, it just all went crazy. We just had attacks on greyheads, and all the summer breeding species, both light-mantled, dark-mantled, and greyheads were being about 5% were attacked and killed by mice. And yeah, just one of the things that we've really tried to do is get graphic footage of this. So this is still the best footage we have. There's actually a video of this mouse eating this poor little wandering albatross chick's head, and the chick died the next day. And that footage really drove the politicians to say, we've got to do something about this. Unfortunately, there is something we can do about it. It's not very elegant, but it basically, you use helicopters to drop poison bait over the whole island. It's a really well-established technique for getting rid of rats on islands. Managed to get rid of rats from South Georgia even, which is a massive island, 3,000 square kilometers, so 10 times bigger than Marion. But the thing with South Georgia was that it was divided by glaciers into sub-islands, so they were able to do it over 3 different seasons. Marion will have to be a single operation. So you've got to go there, and in the space of a week or so, you've got to make sure that you deliver bait to the whole island.
Literally covers.
Why is that, Pete? Why is there such an urgency in such a short space of time?
Because if you leave part of the island, the mice can migrate out of that into an area that you've cleaned. So,
okay, so that's what you meant with the glaciers, is the separated smaller sections.
Yeah.
And they couldn't move across the glaciers.
They didn't move across the ice barriers. Yeah.
And I mean, obviously this is an obvious question, but maybe just to explain it, the bait is obviously very specific for the mice. There's no danger of any other animals picking it up.
No, there's secondary poisoning issues for birds, so we have to manage that process. So the goal on Marion is to do it in midwinter when there's fewest birds around, and also when the mice are particularly hungry. The downside to winter doing it is the days are short and the weather's crap. So that's not ideal, but most of the sort of northern subantarctic islands have been done in winter because it's more effective. South Georgia they did in summer just because the weather was just not an option any other time. So it depends on the situation, but we're particularly worried about the sheathbills on Marion because they're such generalists. The GPs took a hit on Macquarie when they did there, but hopefully by doing it in midwinter, we'll miss most of the GPs, but there'll be some around, some of the skewers, but again...
So that's not eating the poison, that's eating the carcasses?
Can be both. So the sheathbills will probably eat both.
The GPs will eat the carcasses?
The GPs might eat the pellets. We've done some trials with non-toxic bait to see, and they don't seem to, but you never know. The nice thing is that the poison is relatively slow acting, so the mice tend to disappear into their burrows because they don't feel well. So there's much less of a secondary poisoning risk than there was on Macquarie where there were rabbits, because the rabbits just lay around. So yeah, I don't think secondary poisoning is that much of an issue, but primary poisoning of maybe the kelp gulls and certainly the sheathbills is going to be an issue. Yeah. But the really nice thing about this thing is that if it works, it really makes a huge difference. So in South Georgia, the pipit was virtually extinct in areas where there were rats, and within 5 years, 3 years, they were all over the place, breeding madly, producing loads of chicks. Dom Rollinson, who I believe is out there somewhere, went to South Georgia and didn't see a pipit. And I kind of laughed because we had them flying around the ship before we even got there, but he was just there too early.
I'm sure you've made him feel better.
I do remind him of that occasionally.
And you've just done it again.
Well, now we have a recording of it. We can play it back to him.
We know he's listening.
Yeah. So yeah, and it should be a lasting benefit, because if you eradicate them, as long as you've got adequate biosecurity in place, it's a long-term conservation gain. Even if we crap out the rest of the planet, hopefully the islands will still be out there somewhere. So the plan is to do Goff next year. Goff is definitely a higher priority than Marion. There's a bunch of endemic species that are at risk there, the bunting, Atlantic petrel and so on. Tristan albatross, virtually the entire population's on Goff. So the British RSPB, BirdLife partner, is going to drive that process, and it's well underway. As we speak, the Gullis is down there delivering a whole bunch of equipment ready for the eradication. And the Gullis will return with all the helicopters and all the bait in May next year. And hopefully by this time next year, it will all have happened. And we won't know for sure whether all the mice have been killed. It takes the sort of general rule is you wait 2 to 3 years, and if there's no sign, then you assume that they're gone. So yeah, hopefully we won't see any more mice on the island.
And you're hoping you'll get it all in one go?
It's got to be. I mean, if you just leave a couple, then you're back to square one, because they'll breed up again so quickly. That's the problem with rodents.
No competition.
Yeah, so you just got to get enough. You might not kill every single one, but you've got to reduce them to a density where they can't find a mate.
Okay.
So yeah, the plan for Marion is to do it in 2021. That's Guy Preston's vision. So BirdLife is helping the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, as it's called now. So there's this sort of mouse-free Marion program. You can go online and sponsor a hectare of Marion. We're looking for I think currently with the exchange rate, it's up to about 40 million rand just for the bait. Because Marion is a big island, and one of the problems with mice is they have very small home ranges, so you've got to be very precise, and you've got to bait at a high density because you've got to get bait to every territory.
Sure.
So rats, you can be a little bit more lax, and your baiting density can be lower. But for mice, it's a very technical operation. So these guys, the guys who fly the helicopters, they've got like a little light indicator on a GPS display thing, and they've got a 2-meter tolerance either side. So if they move 2 meters one way or the other, and you can imagine trying to do that in Southern Ocean wind conditions, you know, and they've got to keep a reasonably close tolerance of height above the ground.
Yeah.
The bait bucket spreads the bait over a sort of a cone, and the higher you are, the more it spreads. So you need to be at a fixed height, and you need to be on this line. And you look at the GPS tracks of the good pilots, and they just look like straight lines.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And then you look at somebody who's there was a guy who'd had like 30 years flying experience, went to South Georgia, I can do this, and his lines were all over, and it was like that, sorry.
And where do you find these pilots?
Pretty much all New Zealanders.
Okay.
Yeah. So the New Zealanders came up with this technology. They do a lot of like fertilizer spreading, and you know, New Zealand's a very ruggedy kind of place. So a lot of agricultural application is done by helicopter. So there's a bunch of guys who do this kind of work for a living. Yeah, interesting. They get paid well. It's $1,000 an hour, I think it is,
Really?
to be a,
Sure.
and they get, you know, retainer when they're not flying as well and everything. So it's a costly operation to do, but the benefits are great. So I think that's about it. I think that was my last slide.
Well, Pete, that was
amazing.
It was
Thank
amazing.
you. Yeah.
It was a great mixture of amazing. No, it's not. If we've lost some of the audience, it's too bad. But I think it was a great combination of amazing photography and also a lot of information about what's going to be happening on Marion. And I think we've got time to talk about the bird life flock.
Well, we could maybe just give it a very quick plug. So the exciting news is that Flock at Sea number 3 looks like it's going to happen late January 2021. Flock to Marion. So leaving from Durban and coming back to Cape Town, it should be really epic. And it's about 7 days.
Amazing.
Because those big ships move fast. So like an unparalleled opportunity for people to at least go and see the island. You won't get ashore. But just to be able to get offshore and see those birds would be, I think I'll be on board. My leave application's already in for sure.
I'm definitely on board.
Definitely on board.
Are you going to show your?
I'm going to do my quick. Pete, thank you very much. I'm going to quickly do the mystery birds. So I don't know if there's anyone in the chat room, but let's. Pete, did you find? I mean, did you find all 8?
About 6 species. You know, there's black brows and gannets, and there's a dodgy GP, and a city shearwater, and white chins, and a pintado, and there's probably a shy out there somewhere. But
there is a shy, as far as I can tell.
A bit iffy on the shy.
Okay.
So I don't know what that bugger is.
Pete's pointing at that bird over there. Yeah. I think it's a black-browed.
Is it? Okay.
This looks a little bit like a whiteback, but it's not. It's a black-browed.
Okay. I mean, if it was a better picture, we'd be.
I was thinking, you haven't even mentioned the central bird.
Well, that's obvious. Yeah.
So this is what I got. These are black browns at various ages. I got that as a shy. But you're probably going to tell me I'm wrong.
Wow. Yeah.
Am I stretching? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a could be.
Okay, and then there's obviously a Cape Gannet on the left-hand side there. There's a pintado.
Yeah.
The sooty shearwater in the front. And then there's some white chins. There's a GP. I haven't been brave enough to call it. I think it's a southern, but I might be wrong.
Youngsters are always difficult.
And then obviously the prize bird in that lot is the southern fulmer.
I think I got all of those more or less. I couldn't string the shy like you.
I'm not even going to respond. All right, so I think that brings us to the end. I think it was worth going on a little bit longer than normal. So thanks very much to everyone who attended. I know we've had a lot of requests for the video in post-production. So we'll be posting that on YouTube. and that'll be out in a couple of days' time. It takes us a few days to do that.
Yeah.
And we have a good topic in mind for the next one. I think will be probably slightly less interesting because it'll be back to Dave and I, but maybe we'll rustle together a special guest. But if anyone has any questions, you know our email address by now. You're welcome to pop us a mail. Dave, any closing thoughts?
No, a couple of comments here. A lot of people saying, thanks so much. Incredible webinar. Just loved it. From Janet. Gilbert's putting in his leave for the flock.
Very good, man.
Michael Mason, thanks, guys. Awesome talk. It was great to have been there before and reminisce, looking at this pics of Marion. Very informative presentation. Michael Mason's had a dip at some of the, I think he got most of them. Cape Gannet, yeah, Cape Petrel, Mike, you'll like that.
Yeah.
Sooty Shorter, Southern Flora. Yeah, I think he got all of them. Gilbert saying, yeah. Dom saying, great, thanks guys, really great talk. I just got over the pipit, Peter.
You just got over the pipit and now he's been reminded.
It's a nice bird, Dom.
At least it's not that far to go and see it for a second time.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, Pete, thanks so much. It was really
pleasure. It was fun.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Awesome. Cool.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.